A laser sight doesn't look like it does in the movies. It's not a thick, glowing beam cutting through the hazy air. It's just a tiny, trembling speck of crimson, barely larger than a pinhead. When 24-year-old Fiona Dempsey saw that speck dancing over the left lapel of a ruthless syndicate boss, she didn't have time to weigh the moral implications of saving a monster. She just reacted. A shattered bottle of $1,000 wine, a spray of broken glass, and a desperate tackle changed the trajectory of the Chicago underworld forever. This isn't a fairy tale, it's a survival story. The Brass Anchor was the kind of establishment where a simple dinner cost more than Fiona Dempsey's monthly rent for her cramped apartment in Logan Square. Situated on Astor Street in Chicago's Gold Coast, the restaurant was a fortress of mahogany, low amber lighting, and the overwhelming scent of seared Wagyu and white truffles. It was an enclave for the ultra-wealthy, the politically connected, and, occasionally, the highly dangerous. Fiona adjusted her black uniform apron, her hands trembling slightly. It was a Tuesday night, typically a slow shift, but the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to have driven the city's elite indoors. Her feet ached in her sensible black shoes, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight in her chest. Tucked into her locker in the break room was a final notice from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Her younger brother, Toby, needed his next round of immunosuppressants by Friday, and the insurance company had just denied the claim. She was $6,000 short. Dempsey, a sharp voice snapped, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Richard Gable, the floor manager. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat on his receding hairline. Table 4. The private alcove. You're on it. Fiona's stomach dropped. Table 4? Richard, that's usually Sarah's section. Sarah is having a panic attack in the walk-in freezer, Richard hissed, looking nervously toward the back of the dining room. Because table 4 is Dominic Castellano. The name sent a chill through the staff hallway. Everyone in Chicago knew who Dominic Castellano was, even if the local news anchors only ever referred to him as a prominent local developer. He was the head of the Castellano Syndicate, a man who controlled the docks, the unions, and the lucrative underground gambling rings operating out of the South Side. He had been indicted 3 times and walked away without a scratch every single time. Witnesses tended to develop sudden amnesia when it came to Dominic Castellano. He asked for a quiet corner and absolute perfection, Richard warned, aggressively straightening Fiona's collar. Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep his glass full. If you mess this up, Fiona, you're not just fired. I might actually have to leave the state. Taking a deep breath, Fiona grabbed a silver tray holding 2 menus and stepped out onto the dining floor. The private alcove was situated right next to the massive, reinforced glass windows looking out over the rain-slicked street. Dominic Castellano sat with his back to the wall, a classic survival tactic facing the entrance. He wasn't the caricature of a mobster Fiona had expected. He looked to be in his late 30s, possessing a sharp, aristocratic jawline and dark hair lightly frosted with gray at the temples. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Fiona's car. Sitting across from him was a man Fiona recognized from the local papers. Thomas Sterling, a city alderman known for taking bribes and stalling construction permits. Sterling looked terrified, dabbing his forehead with a linen napkin. Flanking the table, standing completely still with their hands clasped in front of them, were 2 large men in dark suits, bodyguards. Fiona approached the table, pasting on her best, neutral customer service smile. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said softly, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Welcome to the Brass Anchor. May I start you with some sparkling water or a cocktail?" Castellano didn't even look at her. His dark, cold eyes were fixed on the sweating alderman. "We don't need menus," Castellano said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the space around it. "Bring us the bone-in ribeyes, medium rare, and a bottle of the 2016 Chateau Margaux, decanted." "Right away, sir," Fiona said, quickly retrieving the menus and backing away. She felt the heavy, intimidating gaze of one of the bodyguards follow her all the way to the sommelier's station. As she waited for the wine to be prepped, Fiona's mind raced. The 2016 Chateau Margaux was a $1,500 bottle. A 20% tip on this table alone would cover a massive chunk of Toby's medication. She just had to survive the next 2 hours without spilling anything on a man who routinely made people disappear. The dinner progressed with an agonizingly slow, suffocating tension. Every time Fiona approached the alcove to clear a plate or refill a water glass, she felt like she was stepping into a cage with a sleeping tiger. The conversation between Castellano and Alderman Sterling was hushed but intensely hostile. Fiona tried to make herself invisible, pouring water with practiced, silent grace. "I don't care what the zoning board said, Tommy," Castellano murmured, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "You promised the waterfront permits by the 1st of the month. It is now the 12th. My cargo ships are sitting in the harbor, bleeding money." "Dom, please, you have to understand," Sterling stammered, his voice cracking. "The mayor is breathing down my neck. There's a federal auditor looking into the shell companies. I just need 2 more weeks to clean the paper trail." "You don't have 2 weeks," Castellano replied calmly, taking a slow sip of his wine. "You have until Friday, or I'll let my associates handle the audit their own way." Fiona retreated to the server station, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the marble counter to steady herself. The casual threat of violence in Castellano's voice was terrifying. It wasn't an angry outburst, it was a simple statement of fact. It was 9:45 p.m. The restaurant was beginning to thin out. Fiona grabbed the crystal decanter containing the remaining Chateau Margaux. It was time to top off their glasses, drop the check, and get the hell out of there. She walked toward the alcove, her eyes focused on the table. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring the streetlights outside into smeared streaks of yellow and red. Across the street was a multi-level parking garage, its concrete face dark and imposing against the stormy sky. As she stepped up to the table, positioning herself to Castellano's right, she raised the heavy crystal decanter. "Gentlemen, would you care for the rest of the—" She stopped. Something caught her eye. A tiny reflection in the polished curve of Castellano's empty wineglass. Fiona blinked, her gaze shifting to the source. It was a pinprick of brilliant, synthetic red light. It flickered against the pristine white tablecloth, moved up the silver stem of a fork, and then jumped. It landed squarely on the left lapel of Dominic Castellano's charcoal suit, right over his heart. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to a crawl. Fiona's brain, desperate to make sense of the anomaly, instantly supplied the answer. She had seen enough crime documentaries with Toby during his long hospital stays to know exactly what that red dot was. Someone was in the parking garage across the street. Someone with a rifle. Castellano was still looking at Sterling, completely oblivious. The bodyguards were scanning the interior of the restaurant, not the windows. Fiona had less than a second to make a choice. She could step back, she could drop to the floor, she could let the bullet hit its mark and rid the city of a notorious criminal. But in that fragmented second, she didn't see a mob boss. She saw a human being who was about to die right in front of her. Instinct raw, unfiltered, and deeply human took the wheel. She didn't shout. There was no time. Fiona dropped the crystal decanter. It slipped from her fingers, but she didn't wait to hear it shatter. She lunged forward, throwing her entire body weight across the table, her arms extending toward Castellano's chest. "Get down!" she screamed, a guttural sound that tore her throat. Her shoulders slammed into Castellano's chest just as the air pressure in the room violently changed. Crack. The sound was deafening, a localized clap of thunder that shook the floorboards. The reinforced glass of the restaurant window exploded inward in a spectacular wave of crystalline shrapnel. Fiona and Castellano went down in a tangle of limbs, ripping the heavy linen tablecloth with them. Plates, silverware, and the remnants of the heavy steaks crashed down upon them. The bullet, which had been aimed perfectly at Castellano's heart, tore through the back of the mahogany chair where he had been sitting a fraction of a second prior, burying itself deep into the plastered wall behind him. Chaos instantly consumed the brass anchor. Diners screamed, diving under tables. Richard Gable let out a high-pitched shriek from the host stand. Fiona lay on the floor, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. She was pinned awkwardly against the hardwood floor, the heavy, muscular frame of the Mafia boss crushing the breath out of her. She could feel something wet and warm seeping through the sleeve of her uniform. Above them, Castellano's bodyguards roared into action. One tackled Alderman Sterling to the ground, while the other, a massive man named Enzo, drew a matte black handgun from inside his jacket and aimed it toward the shattered window, placing himself between the line of fire and his boss. "Boss, are you hit?" Enzo bellowed over the screams of the patrons. Underneath the ruined table, Dominic Castellano shifted. He pushed himself up on his forearms, his dark eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the waitress beneath him. Fiona was pale, gasping for air, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and spilled wine. A long, wicked shard of window glass was protruding from the fleshy part of her left bicep, the blood staining her white blouse crimson. Castellano stared at her, his mind rapidly processing the impossibility of what had just happened. This nobody, this exhausted girl in a cheap apron, had seen the sniper before his highly trained security detail, and she had taken a bullet for him. Or, at the very least, a chest full of glass. "I'm clear," Castellano grunted, his voice tight. He looked back down at Fiona. "Are you out of your mind, kid?" Fiona coughed, the metallic taste of adrenaline thick in her mouth. You're welcome," she wheezed. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a faint, mournful sound cutting through the torrential rain. The sniper across the street hadn't taken a second shot. They knew the element of surprise was gone. "Dom, we gotta move," Enzo yelled, his eyes scanning the dark garage across the street. "Cops will be here in 2 minutes. If we get locked down here, the feds will turn this into a circus." Castellano knew Enzo was right. As a man perpetually under federal surveillance, being caught at the scene of an attempted assassination, especially with a bribed alderman hiding under the table, would result in months of subpoenas and interrogations. He needed to vanish, figure out who had ordered the hit, and retaliate before the streets smelled weakness. He grabbed the edge of the overturned table and shoved it aside. He stood up, dusting off his ruined suit, his demeanor instantly shifting from shocked victim back to the untouchable syndicate boss. "Get the cars to the alley," Castellano ordered his men. He looked down at Fiona. She was struggling to sit up, her right hand clutching her bleeding left arm. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around the ruined restaurant. The realization of what she had just done was beginning to sink in. She had just inserted herself into a mob war. "Leave her," the other bodyguard said, already moving toward the kitchen doors. "Paramedics will patch her up." Castellano hesitated. He looked at the shattered window, the bullet hole in the wall, and then back to the waitress. In his world, coincidence was a myth. People didn't just save his life out of the goodness of their hearts. Was she planted here? Did she know the shooter? Or was she exactly what she appeared to be, a civilian who acted on blind instinct? If he left her for the cops, she would be paraded on the news. The rival family who ordered the hit would see her face. They would realize she was the reason Castellano was still breathing. In the brutal logic of the underworld, she was now a loose end, a target. "No," Castellano said, his voice hard. He reached down, grabbing Fiona by her uninjured arm. "She comes with us." "What?" Fiona gasped, trying to pull away. "No, I need a hospital. You'll get a doctor," Castellano interrupted, hauling her to her feet with frightening ease. "But if you stay here, the people who just tried to put a hole in my chest will come back to finish the job, and they won't care who gets in the way. Walk." Fiona's legs felt like lead, but Castellano propelled her forward. Enzo kicked open the double doors leading into the bustling, panicked kitchen. The kitchen staff parted like the Red Sea, staring in horror as the bloodied Mafia boss dragged their waitress toward the rear exit. They burst out into the back alley. The rain was a torrential downpour, instantly soaking them to the bone. 2 black armored SUVs were already idling, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Enzo threw open the back door of the lead SUV. Castellano practically shoved Fiona inside, climbing in right behind her. Enzo took the driver's seat, flooring the accelerator before the doors were even fully shut. The heavy vehicle surged forward, tires squealing against the wet asphalt, leaving the brass anchor and Fiona's normal life far behind. The interior of the SUV was dark and smelled of expensive leather and gun oil. Fiona pressed herself against the passenger door, clutching her bleeding arm, shivering uncontrollably. Castellano reached into a compartment between the seats, pulling out a first aid kit. He snapped it open, withdrew a heavy gauze pad, and leaned across the seat. "Hold still," he commanded. Fiona flinched away. "Don't touch me." Castellano paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The streetlights flashing past illuminated the hard, unforgiving lines of his face. "You just tackled a 200-pound man into a table full of steak knives. You're bleeding out on my custom upholstery. Let me apply pressure to the wound, or you're going to pass out." Fiona swallowed hard, the fight draining out of her. She allowed him to take her arm. He didn't pull the glass out, he knew better than that, but he wrapped the thick gauze tightly around the base of the shard, binding it with medical tape to stem the heavy flow of blood. His hands, though capable of immense violence, were surprisingly gentle and precise. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, keeping his focus on the bandage. "Fiona," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "Fiona Dempsey." "Well, Fiona Dempsey," Castellano said, tying off the bandage. He leaned back in his seat, watching her with a mix of suspicion and genuine curiosity. "You have terrible survival instincts." "I saved your life," she shot back, a flash of defensive anger cutting through her fear. "Which begs the question," Castellano replied, leaning forward, the shadow hiding his expression. "Why? Why does a waitress at a high-end steakhouse risk her life for a man she's never met? A man the news calls a criminal?" Fiona looked down at her blood-stained lap. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't explain the sheer, unadulterated panic that had seized her, or the way her mind had blanked out everything except the primal urge to prevent death. "I didn't think," she finally admitted, her voice hollow. "I just saw the laser, and I moved." Castellano studied her face for a long, uncomfortable moment. He was a human lie detector, a man who had survived this long by reading the micro-expressions of traitors and thieves. He saw no deception in her eyes, only pure, unadulterated terror. "Where are you taking me?" Fiona asked, her voice trembling. "A safe house," Castellano said, turning his gaze toward the dark, rain-streaked window. "You're in the game now, Fiona. Whether you wanted to be or not, my enemies know your face. Until I find out who hired that shooter, you don't leave my sight." The SUV merged onto the interstate, speeding toward the West Loop. Fiona closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of the hospital bills. She thought of little Toby, waiting for her to come home. She had worried about surviving poverty. She never realized she would have to survive the Mafia. The subterranean parking garage beneath the Fulton Market District was a cavern of reinforced concrete and blinding fluorescent lights. The black SUV glided to a halt in front of a private steel-reinforced elevator bank. Fiona's head swam as Enzo killed the engine. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the shooting at the brass anchor was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, nauseating exhaustion and a throbbing, white-hot pain in her left arm. Dominic Castellano didn't wait for his men to open his door. He stepped out into the damp air of the garage and walked around to Fiona's side, opening it with a sharp pull. "Can you walk?" he asked, his tone clipped, devoid of the earlier trace of curiosity. He was fully in his element now, the general returning to his fortress. "I think so," Fiona muttered, sliding her legs out. The moment her sensible black shoes hit the concrete, her knees buckled. Before she could hit the ground, Dominic's hand shot out, gripping her uninjured arm. With a seamless motion, he hoisted her up, essentially carrying half her body weight as they moved toward the elevator. Enzo scanned the perimeter, a compact submachine gun now resting openly against his thigh, while the second bodyguard flanked them. The elevator required a retinal scan and a 6-digit passcode. When the heavy steel doors slid open, they revealed an expanse that made the brass anchor look quaint. It was a sprawling, hyper-modern penthouse, a masterclass in minimalist intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the city lights bleeding through the relentless rain. The floors were polished dark obsidian, and the furniture was sharp, expensive, and completely uninviting. Waiting for them in the center of the massive living area was a man in his late 50s, carrying a worn leather medical bag. "Dom," the man said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at the blood-soaking Fiona's uniform. "You said a superficial laceration over the phone. That is a penetrating trauma." "Then fix it, Harrison," Dominic ordered, guiding Fiona to a pristine white leather sofa. He forced her to sit down. She took a dive into a table full of shattered crystal. "Wrap it up. Make sure there's no glass left in the muscle." Dr. Harrison didn't ask questions. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who was used to treating gunshot wounds at 3 a.m. without filing a police report. He cut away the ruined sleeve of Fiona's white blouse, exposing the ugly, jagged shard of glass embedded deep in her bicep. "This is going to hurt, Miss Dempsey," Dr. Harrison murmured, preparing a syringe of local anesthetic. "I need you to stay as still as possible." Fiona gripped the edge of the leather sofa with her right hand, her knuckles turning white. As the needle pierced her skin, she squeezed her eyes shut. But it wasn't the physical pain that was making her chest heave with panic. It was the clock ticking in her head. It was past 11. Toby's night nurse, a kind older woman named Maria, would be wondering why Fiona hadn't called for her post-shift check-in. "I need my phone," Fiona gasped, her eyes flying open. She tried to reach for her apron pocket, but Dr. Harrison gently pushed her back down. "Hold still," the doctor warned, clamping a pair of surgical forceps onto the protruding glass. "Please." Fiona looked up at Dominic, who was standing a few feet away, watching the procedure with unblinking intensity. He had removed his ruined suit jacket, revealing a tailored black dress shirt and a holstered firearm strapped over his ribs. "My phone. It's in my apron. I have to make a call." Dominic nodded to Enzo. The massive bodyguard reached into the blood-stained pocket of Fiona's discarded apron and pulled out her cracked, outdated smartphone. He didn't hand it to her. He handed it to Dominic. "Who are you calling?" Dominic asked, looking at the locked screen. "My brother," Fiona said, wincing as Dr. Harrison extracted the glass shard with a sickening squelch. "He's at Street Jude. He's sick. If I don't call the night desk, he'll think something happened to me." Dominic's thumb hovered over the screen. He looked at her, his dark eyes analyzing the desperation radiating from her small frame. In his world, a family member was leverage, a weakness to be exploited. But the sheer terror in Fiona's eyes wasn't a calculated play. It was the raw, bleeding heart of a girl who had nothing left to lose but a sick child. "Enzo," Dominic said softly, never breaking eye contact with Fiona. "Run the name. Toby Dempsey, Street Jude Children's Research Hospital." "No." Fiona tried to lunge forward, but the doctor pinned her shoulder down as he began to stitch the wound. "Leave him out of this. You have no right." "I have every right," Dominic countered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "A sniper just put a bullet through my dinner table. You, a complete stranger, saved my life. And now you're desperate to contact the outside world. I don't believe in coincidences, Fiona. Until I know exactly who you are, I know everything about you." For the next 10 minutes, the penthouse was suffocatingly silent, save for the heavy rain lashing against the glass and the quiet snip of the doctor's scissors. Fiona felt hot tears of frustration and helplessness slide down her cheeks. She had survived the shooting, only to be swallowed whole by a monster of a different breed. Enzo walked back into the room, holding a sleek tablet. He handed it to Dominic. Dominic's eyes scanned the screen. The hard, ruthless lines of his face imperceptibly softened. He read the file, reading between the lines of the sterile medical codes and financial summaries. Tobias Dempsey. Age 9, Dominic read aloud, his voice devoid of inflection. Aplastic anemia. 2 failed bone marrow transplants. Currently reliant on a heavy regimen of immunosuppressants to survive. And, he paused, just lifting, just tear-filled eyes, a final denial of coverage from Blue Cross. "You're $6,000 in arrears, Fiona. If you don't pay by Friday, they discharge him." Fiona looked away, the shame and fear finally breaking her composure. A soft sob escaped her lips. "I was going to figure it out," she whispered to the floor. "The tips from your table. I was going to beg the billing department. Just let me call him." Dominic stared at her. This girl had thrown herself in front of a high-velocity rifle to save a Mafia boss, all while carrying the weight of a dying brother and crushing poverty. It was a level of selflessness that simply did not exist in his ecosystem. It baffled him. It intrigued him. And, in a strange, twisted way, it demanded his respect. He pulled his own phone from his pocket and dialed a number. He put it on speaker. Dominic, a groggy, patrician voice, answered after the 3rd ring. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Wake up, Arthur," Dominic said casually. "I need a favor." "I am the chief of medicine at Street Jude, Dominic, not your personal concierge," the voice sighed heavily. "What is it?" "You have a patient in the pediatric oncology ward, Tobias Dempsey," Dominic said, walking slowly toward Fiona. "He requires a specialized medication regimen. I am having my accountant wire $250,000 to the hospital's general endowment fund, first thing in the morning." Fiona's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. The doctor stopped stitching. "That's incredibly generous, Dominic," Dr. Arthur stammered, the annoyance vanishing from his voice. "But what does that have to do with the Dempsey boy?" The money comes with a strict stipulation, Dominic continued, his eyes locked on Fiona. Tobias Dempsey's medical bills are officially zeroed out. Past, present, and future. He gets a private room. He gets the best attending physicians on your staff. If he needs a specialist flown in from Zurich, you fly them in. If I find out this boy has been discharged, or if his sister receives so much as a bill for a Band-Aid, I will personally ensure your hospital's union workers go on a strike that will last until the next ice age. Are we clear? Silence hung heavily on the line. Crystal clear, Mr. Castellano. I will flag the file personally. Dominic hung up the phone. He tossed Fiona's cracked smartphone onto her lap. Call your brother, he said quietly. Tell him you picked up a double shift. Tell him you'll be there tomorrow. Fiona stared at the phone, her hands trembling. She looked up at the man who had just erased the defining nightmare of her life with a single threatening phone call. Why? She choked out. Why would you do that? You paid for my life with a tackle, Dominic said, turning away to look out at the storm ravaging the city. Consider us even. But as he stared at his reflection in the glass, Dominic knew it wasn't true. They weren't even. In the brutal economy of the Chicago underworld, a life debt was a chain that bound two souls together. And Dominic Castellano had just forged the first link. The penthouse was eerily quiet the next morning, the storm having passed, leaving the Chicago skyline scrubbed clean and gleaming under a pale, watery sun. Fiona awoke on the white leather sofa, a heavy cashmere throw draped over her. Her left arm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, the bandages stark white against her pale skin. She sat up, wincing as the memories of the previous night flooded back. The red dot, the shattered glass, the blood, the impossible phone call that had secured Toby's life. Drink this, a gruff voice commanded. Fiona jumped. Enzo was standing near the kitchen island, holding out a steaming mug of black coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, his suit slightly rumpled, his eyes hyper-alert. Thank you, she murmured, taking the mug. The heat seeped into her cold hands. Where is he? The boss is working, Enzo said vaguely, nodding toward a pair of heavy frosted glass doors at the far end of the penthouse. He said, you stay put. Your brother's hospital is on lockdown. We got two of our best guys posing as private security in the pediatric ward. Nobody gets near the kid. Fiona's stomach twisted. The realization that armed mobsters were currently guarding a 9-year-old boy in a cancer ward was simultaneously the most comforting and terrifying thought she had ever processed. This is insane, she whispered into her coffee. I'm just a waitress. Not anymore, kid, Enzo grunted, cleaning his fingernails with a sleek pocket knife. You stepped onto the board. Now you're a piece in play. Before Fiona could ask what that meant, the frosted glass doors slid open. Dominic emerged, rolling up the sleeves of a fresh white dress shirt. He looked dangerous, rested, focused, and radiating a predatory energy. Trailing behind him was the second bodyguard from the restaurant, dragging a man by the scruff of his neck. Fiona gasped, nearly dropping her coffee. It was Richard Gable, the floor manager of the Brass Anchor. His face was bruised, his expensive suit torn, and he was trembling so violently he could barely stand. The bodyguard threw him to the floor at Dominic's feet. Fiona, Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't look at her, his eyes were fixed on the sobbing manager. Come here. Hesitantly, Fiona stood up, clutching her injured arm to her chest. She walked over to where Dominic stood. Richard looked up at her, his eyes wide with terror. Fiona, please, Richard begged, spittle flying from his lips. Tell him I didn't know. Tell him. Tell me what? Fiona asked, her voice shaking. At 8 p.m. yesterday, Dominic said, pacing slowly around the trembling man, my security detail did a sweep of the restaurant. We requested table 12, in the center of the room, away from the windows. It's standard protocol. Dominic stopped pacing and crouched down, forcing Richard to look him in the eye. But at 8:15 p.m., Richard here decided that a VIP like me deserved the private alcove. The one with the lovely view of the street, and the lovely line of sight from the parking garage. Fiona's breath hitched. She remembered the beginning of her shift. Sarah is having a panic attack. Table 4. You're on it. He made Sarah sick, Fiona realized aloud, the puzzle pieces snapping together in her mind. He put something in her drink so she couldn't work the VIP section. He forced me to take the table. Exactly, Dominic said, standing up. because a seasoned waitress like Sarah might have noticed the spotter across the street. But a desperate, exhausted 24-year-old worried about her brother? She would be too distracted. You were supposed to be collateral damage, Fiona. Richard began to weep openly, curling into a ball on the floor. The Morettis, he wailed. Vincent Moretti said it was just to scare you, Mr. Castellano. He said he just wanted to put a bullet in the wall to send a message about the union contracts. He swore nobody would get hurt. They paid me $50,000 just to move your table. The name hung in the air like a foul odor. The Moretti Syndicate, the brutal, old-school rivals who controlled the South Side gambling operations. Vincent Moretti was a notoriously unstable underboss, a man who solved disputes with explosives rather than negotiations. Dominic looked down at the pathetic manager, his face devoid of any mercy. Vincent Moretti doesn't hire snipers from a quarter-mile away to send a message, Richard. He hires them to take heads off. If it wasn't for this girl's reflexes, my brains would be decorating your expensive wallpaper. Dominic turned to Enzo. Take him to the harbor. Put him in a shipping container. Let him think about his choices in the dark for a few days. No! Richard screamed as Enzo hauled him to his feet. Mr. Castellano, please, I have a family. So does she, Dominic replied coldly, gesturing to Fiona. Get him out of my sight. As the heavy penthouse doors closed behind Enzo and the screaming manager, silence descended once again. Fiona stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was staring at a man who could order a kidnapping as casually as ordering a coffee. Dominic turned to face her. He noticed the terror in her eyes, the way she was subtly leaning away from him. This is the world you inserted yourself into, Fiona, he said quietly, walking toward the massive windows. He looked out over his city. The Morettis paid for a hit. They failed. In my business, failure demands a response. If I don't retaliate, I look weak, and weakness invites slaughter. So what happens now? Fiona asked, her voice remarkably steady despite her fear. You go to war? We go to war, Dominic corrected, turning his head slightly to look at her. The shooter didn't get me, but my tech team pulled the security footage from the parking garage across the street. He tapped a button on a sleek remote resting on the kitchen island. A massive flat-screen television on the wall flared to life. It displayed a grainy, digitized image captured from a high-angle security camera. It was a zoomed-in shot of the restaurant window, taken mere seconds after the gunshot. The glass was shattered, the table overturned, and there, illuminated by the flashing streetlights, was Fiona. She was pinned beneath Dominic, her face clearly visible as she looked up in shock. The sniper was wearing a body camera, Dominic explained, his voice grim. Standard practice for high-level hits to provide proof of death to the employer. This footage was intercepted by my team this morning. It's bouncing around the dark web right now. Fiona felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs went weak, and she leaned heavily against the kitchen island for support. They know, she whispered, the reality crashing down on her like a physical weight. They know I stopped the bullet. Vincent Moretti just lost $1 million contract to take me out, Dominic said, stepping away from the window and closing the distance between them. He stopped just inches away, his towering presence casting a shadow over her. And he lost it because of a waitress. You embarrassed him in front of the entire underworld. To the Morettis, you aren't an innocent bystander anymore, Fiona. You're the reason I'm still breathing. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently grasping her chin, forcing her to look up into his dark, storm-gray eyes. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her spine, a confusing mix of paralyzing fear and undeniable magnetism. They will come for you, Dominic said softly, stating a terrifying fact with absolute certainty. They will try to use you to get to me, or they will kill you just to make a point. Fiona swallowed hard, her eyes locked with his. Then let me go. Let me take Toby and disappear. You can't run fast enough to escape them, Dominic replied, his thumb lightly grazing the edge of her jawline. Your only chance of surviving the next week is to stay exactly where you are, behind my walls, behind my guns. He dropped his hand, taking a step back, the emotional distance instantly re-established. You saved my life, Fiona Dempsey, Dominic said, turning to walk back toward his office. Now I have to save yours. For the next 48 hours, the penthouse became a gilded cage. Fiona's world was reduced to 4,000 square feet of obsidian floors, soundproof glass, and the constant, suffocating presence of armed men. Dominic's organization operated with a terrifying corporate efficiency. The living room had been transformed into a war room. Massive holographic displays and tactical maps covered the walls, replacing the minimalist art. Men in sharp suits and men in heavy tactical gear moved in and out, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Through it all, Dominic orchestrated the chaos like a maestro, his voice rarely rising above a calm, authoritative murmur. But Fiona couldn't focus on the mob war brewing in her living room. Her mind was entirely consumed by the hospital across the city. "I have to see him," Fiona demanded, on the morning of the third day. She stood in the doorway of Dominic's office, her left arm in a black sling. Dominic looked up from a stack of shipping manifests, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He hadn't slept since the night at the Brass Anchor. "No, it's too dangerous. The hospital is secure, but the transit is a vulnerability." "You promised me he was okay," Fiona fired back, stepping fully into the office, her voice trembling with a potent mix of fear and defiance. "I've talked to him on the phone, but he sounds weak. He's 9 years old, Dominic. He's terrified. He's in a strange new room, and his sister isn't there. If you don't take me to him, I will walk out that front door and take my chances with the snipers." Dominic stared at her. His men in the outer room went dead silent, waiting for the explosion. Nobody threatened Dominic Castellano in his own fortress. But the explosion never came. Dominic saw the feral, desperate light in her eyes. It was the exact same look she had when she threw herself across the table to take a bullet for him. She wasn't bluffing. He let out a slow, measured breath and closed his laptop. "Enzo," he called out, "prep the armored convoy. Route C, we're going to Street Jude." The journey to the hospital was a masterclass in paranoia. Fiona rode in the back of a reinforced SUV, sandwiched between two identical vehicles. Dominic sat beside her, a heavy rifle resting casually across his knees. He watched the streets with the intensity of a hunting hawk, his eyes tracking every parked car, every pedestrian, every open window. When they arrived at the pediatric oncology ward, the atmosphere was surreal. Two heavily armed men in sharp suits were stationed outside, room 412, looking entirely out of place amidst the brightly colored murals of cartoon animals. Fiona practically shoved past them, bursting into the room. It was massive, bathed in natural light, with a private bathroom, a massive television, and top-of-the-line medical equipment. Sitting in the center of the mechanical bed was Toby. He was pale, his head bald from the treatments, and tubes snaked from his arms. But when he saw Fiona, his sunken eyes lit up with a brilliance that broke her heart. "Fiona," he rasped, holding out his thin arms. She rushed to the bed, burying her face in his neck, being careful not to jostle his IV lines. "I'm here, buddy." "I'm right here," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I'm so sorry I couldn't come sooner." Work was. It was crazy. "It's okay," Toby said, his voice weak but excited. "The nurses said a secret billionaire paid for everything. And look, they brought me a PlayStation 5. The doctor said I don't have to leave." Fiona looked up, wiping her eyes. Standing in the doorway, his massive frame, dwarfed by the pediatric doorframe, was Dominic. He had left his rifle in the car, and his face had softened into something resembling approachability. "Toby," Fiona said, her voice catching, This is my boss, Mr. Castellano. He's the one who helped us." Toby's eyes widened. He looked at the imposing man in the bespoke suit. "Are you the secret billionaire?" Dominic stepped into the room, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. It transformed his face, making him look younger, stripping away the ruthless edge of the syndicate boss. "Something like that," Dominic said, his gravelly voice remarkably gentle. "Your sister is a very important employee. She went above and beyond the call of duty. Taking care of you is the least I could do." "Thank you, sir," Toby said earnestly. "Fiona cries a lot about the bills when she thinks I'm sleeping. She won't have to cry anymore." Fiona flushed, looking down at the linoleum floor. She felt Dominic's gaze on her, heavy and calculating, but lacking its usual coldness. "No," Dominic said softly, his eyes fixed on Fiona. "She won't." The moment of peace was fleeting. As they rode the elevator back down to the subterranean parking garage, Enzo's earpiece crackled. The bodyguard's face went rigid. "Boss," Enzo said, stepping between Dominic and the elevator doors, "We have a situation. 3 of our illegal casinos on the south side just got firebombed, simultaneously. The Morettas are making a play for the territory while they think we're pinned down." Dominic's gentle demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, glacial calm. The Mafia boss had returned. "Are there casualties?" "4 dead," Enzo grimaced. 2 civilians. Fiona felt the blood drain from her face. Civilians, collateral damage. This was the reality of the man standing next to her. He had saved her brother, but he was drowning the city in blood. "Get us back to the penthouse," Dominic ordered, racking the slide of his handgun. "Tell the strike teams to greenlight Operation Brimstone. If Vincent Moretti wants to burn down my city, I'm going to make sure he dies in the ashes." That night, Fiona sat on the edge of her bed, watching the local news on mute. The screen was filled with images of blazing buildings, police barricades, and body bags. The war had officially begun, and she was trapped right in the epicenter. 4 days passed in a blur of escalating violence. The news anchor spoke of a gangland resurgence plaguing Chicago. To Fiona, it was a waking nightmare. The penthouse smelled permanently of stale coffee, gun oil, and anxious sweat. Dominic was a phantom. He slept in 2-hour shifts, spending his days coordinating attacks and defenses, aggressively dismantling the Moretti syndicate piece by piece. He was winning, but the cost was astronomical. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The war room was finally empty, the guards rotating out to their perimeter stations. Fiona couldn't sleep. The phantom pain in her healing arm and the relentless anxiety kept her pacing the obsidian floors. She wandered into the massive, dark kitchen to get a glass of water, only to freeze. Dominic was sitting at the marble island, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A half-empty bottle of Lagavulin scotch sat next to a crystal glass. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his shoulder holster was unbuckled, the weapon resting heavily on the counter. He looked utterly hollowed out, the shadows under his eyes stark and bruised. "You should be sleeping," Dominic said without looking up, hearing her bare feet on the floorboards. "So should you," Fiona replied softly, moving to the sink to fill her glass. She turned and leaned against the counter, studying him. The fear she initially felt for him had morphed into something deeply complicated. He was a ruthless killer, yet he was the only reason she and Toby were alive. "Why did you do it?" Fiona asked, the silence of the room giving her a sudden burst of courage. "Toby, the hospital. You could have just kept me here. You didn't have to spend $250,000 on a stranger." Dominic took a slow sip of his scotch. He looked out at the city lights, his jaw clenched tight. "When I was 19, he began, his voice a low, raspy whisper that barely carried across the kitchen. "My father was the head of this family. I had a little sister, Sophia. She was 8. Fiona's breath hitched. She had read the news articles about Dominic. None of them mentioned a sister. "We were in a restaurant," Dominic continued, his eyes unfocused, staring into a past he clearly tried to keep buried. "A rival crew walked in. They were aiming for my father, but their aim was bad. They hit Sophia instead." He stopped, his knuckles turning white around his glass. "I watched her bleed out on the floor of a pizzeria," Dominic said, the raw, unhealed agony in his voice making Fiona's chest ache. "I couldn't do anything to stop it. I was powerless. So, when I saw you, this terrified, desperate girl, throw yourself into the line of fire to save someone you didn't even know, it broke something in me. I couldn't let you lose your brother. Not when I had the power to stop it." Fiona walked over to the island, pulling out a stool and sitting across from him. She reached out, her small, pale hand resting lightly over his massive, scarred one. He didn't pull away. "You aren't just a monster, Dominic," she whispered. He finally looked at her, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers. The tension between them was palpable, a heavy, electric charge that made the air in the room feel thick. He turned his hand over, his fingers gently threading through hers. "In my world, Fiona, monsters are the only ones who survive," he murmured, leaning closer. Before the space between them could vanish, the penthouse plunged into absolute darkness. The low hum of the refrigerator died. The glowing city skyline outside was instantly obscured as heavy, reinforced steel shutters automatically slammed down over the floor-to-ceiling windows with a series of deafening, metallic clangs. Emergency red lights strobed to life along the baseboards, bathing the kitchen in the color of fresh blood. Dominic moved with terrifying speed. In a fraction of a second, his hand left hers, snatched the gun off the counter, and grabbed Fiona by the waist, hauling her behind the thick marble island. "What's happening?" Fiona gasped, panic seizing her throat. Power grid to the building was just severed, Dominic hissed, checking the magazine of his weapon. The automated lockdown engaged. The heavy oak doors of the war room burst open. Enzo slid into the kitchen, his submachine gun raised, a tactical flashlight cutting through the red emergency lights. "Boss!" Enzo yelled, his voice tight with genuine fear. "It's not a mob hit. The perimeter guards are dead. They used silenced weapons. We have heavily armed men breaching the private elevators right now." "Moretti's men?" Dominic asked, pushing Fiona further behind him. "Worse," Enzo said grimly. "They're wearing tactical gear. Strobe lights, riot shields. It's a rogue SWAT team, Dom. Moretti didn't send a hit squad. He bought off the police captain. They're coming to execute you under the guise of a no-knock raid." Fiona's blood ran cold. If it was a rival gang, Dominic's men could shoot back. But if they fired on a police SWAT team, even a corrupt one, the full weight of the federal government would crush them all. There would be nowhere to run. Moretti had orchestrated a checkmate. Boom. The sound of a breaching charge echoed from the far side of the penthouse, shaking the floor beneath Fiona's feet. The heavy steel elevator doors had been blown off their hinges. "They're in," Enzo shouted, taking cover behind a structural pillar. "We have to use the panic room, Dom." "No," Dominic snapped, his tactical mind instantly overriding the chaos. "A panic room is a coffin if they have heavy explosives. We need the service tunnels." He hauled Fiona to her feet. "Do not let go of my hand," he ordered, his eyes blazing with a feral intensity. "If we get separated, you run. You don't look back." Gunfire erupted from the living room. The deafening roar of assault rifles shattered the expensive artwork and shredded the walls. Enzo returned fire, laying down a suppressing spray of bullets to buy them time. Dominic dragged Fiona toward the rear of the kitchen. He kicked open a massive walk-in pantry door, shoved a heavy shelving unit aside, and punched a code into a hidden keypad on the wall. A section of the paneling hissed open, revealing a dark, narrow concrete stairwell that plunged down into the bowels of the building. "Go!" Dominic yelled, shoving her into the darkness just as a line of bullets ripped through the marble island where they had been sitting seconds before. Fiona stumbled down the concrete stairs in the pitch black, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She was plunging into the dark, with a rogue police squad hunting her, tethered to the most dangerous man in Chicago. The war had just reached their doorstep, and there was nowhere left to hide. The hidden stairwell smelled of ancient concrete, rust, and the metallic tang of cordite drifting down from the war zone above. Total darkness swallowed them the moment the pantry panel slid shut, cutting off the blinding red strobe lights of the penthouse. Dominic's grip on Fiona's hand was like a vice, not meant to hurt, but to anchor. "Keep your hand on the wall. Count the landings. Do not speak," Dominic breathed, his voice a vibration in the suffocating black. Above them, the muffled, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of suppressed automatic weapons echoed through the structure of the building. Enzo and the remaining guards were buying them time with their lives. Fiona's lungs burned as they descended rapidly, her bare feet scraping against the rough concrete. The phantom pain in her stitched arm flared into a sharp, blinding agony, but she bit her lip, swallowing the whimper that clawed at her throat. They hit the fifth landing when the massive steel door above them was blown off its hinges. The shockwave rattled the dust from the ceiling, showering them in grit. Heavy tactical boots hit the metal stairs. "They found the panel," Dominic whispered, his tone utterly devoid of panic. It was the icy voice of a predator calculating odds. "They have night vision. We have to move faster." He let go of her hand, wrapping his arm around her waist instead, practically lifting her off her feet as they plunged down the remaining flights. They burst through a heavy fire door at the very bottom, tumbling into the sub-basement. It was a labyrinth of massive HVAC units, rusted boiler pipes, and humming generators. Dim, yellow emergency bulbs cast long, skeletal shadows across the damp floor. "The access hatch is at the north wall," Dominic said, moving tactically between the massive iron boilers, his gun raised. "It leads to an old Prohibition-era drainage tunnel that empties out near the river." Suddenly, a brilliant beam of white light cut through the gloom, accompanied by the distinct clack of a rifle being shouldered. "Castellano! Drop it!" A distorted voice boomed from the shadows to their left. It wasn't a rival mobster. It was a SWAT operator in full tactical gear, a Kevlar helmet obscuring his face, the barrel of his M4 carbine aimed squarely at Dominic's chest. The corrupt police captain hadn't just breached the penthouse, he had sent men to cut off the escape routes. Dominic didn't hesitate. He didn't drop his weapon. He shoved Fiona violently behind a thick concrete pillar just as the operator squeezed the trigger. The sub-basement erupted in deafening gunfire. Bullets sparked against the iron boilers, filling the air with a blinding shower of sparks and a cloud of pulverized concrete. Fiona covered her ears, screaming as chips of stone rained down on her. She heard a heavy, wet thud, followed by the clatter of a rifle hitting the floor. The firing stopped. "Dominic," Fiona gasped, her voice trembling. "Silence." She peeked around the edge of the pillar. The SWAT operator was lying on his back, his visor shattered. Standing 10 feet away, leaning heavily against a rusted pipe, was Dominic. His gun was still raised, smoke curling from the barrel, but his left hand was pressed tightly against his side. Dark, almost black blood was seeping through the fingers of his white dress shirt, dripping steadily onto the concrete. "Dominic!" Fiona rushed forward, the terror momentarily eclipsed by the sight of him bleeding. "I'm fine," he grunted through clenched teeth, though his face was terrifyingly pale under the yellow lights. The bullet had bypassed his ballistic vest, catching him under the ribs. "It's a through and through. We have to go. More are coming down." He stumbled, his massive frame swaying. Instinct took over. The waitress who had tackled him to the floor at the brass anchor surfaced once again. Fiona stepped under his uninjured arm, wrapping her arms around his waist, taking as much of his weight as she could bear. "I got you," she whispered fiercely. "Just point me to the hatch." Together, they hobbled through the maze of machinery. Every step was agonizing. The sound of boots descending the stairwell grew louder, echoing through the cavernous basement. They reached the north wall. Hidden behind a stack of rotted wooden pallets was a heavy circular iron wheel set into a steel door. "Turn it." Counterclockwise, Dominic wheezed, sliding down the wall, his gun trained on the corridor behind them. Fiona grabbed the frozen iron wheel with both hands. She pulled with everything she had, her stitched biceps screaming in protest. Blood began to seep through her own bandages, but she didn't stop. With a horrific groan of rust and metal, the wheel gave way. The heavy door swung outward, revealing a black, damp tunnel that smelled of the river. "Go," Dominic ordered, pushing himself off the wall. They slipped into the tunnel just as flashlight beams swept across the sub-basement behind them. Fiona pulled the heavy door shut, throwing the interior latch just as a barrage of bullets slammed against the thick steel. They were entombed in the dark, the sounds of the city muffled by millions of tons of concrete and earth. Dominic leaned heavily against her, his breathing shallow and ragged. "We made it," Fiona breathed, tears of sheer exhaustion mixing with the dirt on her face. "Not yet," Dominic murmured, his head resting briefly against hers in the absolute dark. "Keep walking, Fiona. Follow the draft." They emerged 20 minutes later from a rusted grate hidden beneath the Wacker Drive overpass. The cold Chicago air hit them like a physical blow. The rain had returned, a fine, freezing mist that chilled them to the bone. Waiting under the bridge, completely invisible from the street above, was a battered, unassuming gray sedan. Leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands, was Enzo. His suit was ruined, and he had a nasty gash across his forehead, but he was alive. When he saw Dominic bleeding, he tossed the cigarette and sprinted forward. "Boss, get him in the back." The next few hours blurred into a surreal, bloody fever dream. Enzo drove them to an abandoned meatpacking facility in the West Loop. There was no penthouse, no luxury. Just sterile lights, plastic sheeting, and the same underground doctor, Harrison, who had stitched Fiona's arm days ago. Fiona sat on a metal folding chair, shivering under a thermal blanket, while Dr. Harrison dug the bullet fragments out of Dominic's side. Dominic didn't take any anesthetic. He simply bit down on a leather strap, his eyes locked on the ceiling, a cold, terrifying rage settling over his features. When the wound was finally packed and stitched, Dominic sat up. He looked at Enzo. "Did Brimstone execute?" Dominic asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "Yeah, Dom," Enzo said quietly, handing his boss a burner phone. 10 minutes ago. Our strike team hit the Moretti compound in Lake Forest. Vincent Moretti is dead. Half his lieutenants are gone. The police captain who ordered the SWAT raid just had a sudden, fatal heart attack in his own driveway. It's over. You hold the city." Dominic took the phone. He stared at the blank screen for a long time. The war was won. His empire was secure. The men who had tried to put a red dot on his chest were corpses in the rain. Slowly, Dominic turned his head to look at Fiona. She looked so incredibly small, wrapped in the silver blanket, her dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. The white bandage on her arm was stained pink. She had been dragged through hell, nearly executed by corrupt police, and forced into the darkest corners of the underworld. And she hadn't broken. Dominic stood up, wincing slightly, and walked over to her. He pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from the inner pocket of Enzo's jacket and handed it to her. "What is this?" Fiona asked, looking up at him. "Your way out," Dominic said softly. Fiona opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pristine blue United States passports. The photos were of her and Toby, but the names were different. Tucked behind the passports were a set of offshore bank account details and a stack of bearer bonds that made Fiona's head spin. It was millions of dollars, enough to live 10 lifetimes. "There's a private jet fueled and waiting at O'Hare," Dominic explained, his eyes tracing the contours of her face as if memorizing it. "It leaves in 2 hours. Enzo will take you to Street Jude to collect Tobias. The hospital staff has been instructed to release him to a private medical transport. The jet will take you to a villa I own in San Sebastian, Spain. It's a coastal town. Good doctors, clean air." Fiona stared at the staggering wealth in her hands. Her heart physically ached. "You're sending me away." "I am saving you," Dominic corrected, crouching down so he was eye level with her. The dangerous mob boss was entirely absent. He was just a man, scarred and tired, making the hardest choice of his life. "The girl who worked at the Brass Anchor died in that restaurant, Fiona. If you stay in Chicago, my enemies will eventually figure out who you are. The police will ask questions. I can protect you from bullets, but I cannot protect you from the rot of this life. It consumes everything it touches. I won't let it consume you." Tears spilled hotly down Fiona's cheeks. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing against the stubble on his jawline. "What about you?" "I am exactly where I belong," Dominic whispered, leaning into her touch for a fleeting, heartbreaking second. He closed his eyes, sealing away the impossible what-ifs. Then he stood up, the emotional distance slamming back into place like a steel vault door. He looked at Enzo. "Get her to the airport. Do not let her out of your sight until those wheels are up." Dominic turned his back to her, walking toward the shadows of the warehouse. "Dominic," Fiona called out, her voice cracking. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. "Thank you," she whispered. "For Toby." "Have a good life, Fiona," Dominic said to the darkness. And then, the phantom of the South Side disappeared into the night. 2 years later. The sun beat down warmly on the cobblestone streets of San Sebastian. The smell of salt water, fresh baked bread, and roasting garlic filled the air. Fiona, wearing a breezy linen sundress, set a basket of fresh produce on the counter of her bright, airy kitchen overlooking the Bay of Biscay. Her skin was tanned, the dark circles under her eyes entirely gone. "Catch it, Toby!" a voice shouted from the beach below. Fiona smiled, walking to the open window. Down on the sand, an 11-year-old Toby, his hair grown back thick and dark, was laughing hysterically as he chased a soccer ball with a group of local Spanish boys. He was vibrant. He was alive. Fiona took a sip of her espresso and picked up her tablet, scrolling through the international news feeds. A headline caught her eye. Chicago syndicate boss Dominic Castellano acquitted again. Secures massive waterfront development. There was a photo attached. Dominic looked sharper, older, his hair a bit more silver, his tailored suit flawless. His eyes were just as cold and calculating as they had been the night she met him. Fiona smiled softly, her right hand instinctively reaching up to rub the faded, jagged scar on her left bicep. It was the only physical proof she had that the nightmare and the dark, terrifying guardian angel who had saved them was real. She turned off the tablet, walking back to the window to watch her brother play in the sun. The red dot had brought death to Dominic Castellano's table, but for Fiona, it had pointed the way to a beautifully, safely rewritten life. If this story had your heart racing and you felt the tension of the red dot dancing across the room, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the algorithm know you love high stakes, real-world drama just as much as we do. What would you have done if you saw that laser sight? Would you risk it all for a stranger or walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves mob stories, unexpected twists, and ultimate survival tales. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our weekly deep dives into the most thrilling, adrenaline-pumping stories on the internet. See you in the next one.